on quite an important decision. Do you want to adopt a phased approach, in other words, introducing WISE work into one area of the organisation first, and then the next, and then the next, or alternatively roll it out across the whole organisation in one fell swoop? Whatever you do here, I point out that planning is the key to success. Without that, it won't work. If we look at our client work that we've done, there seems to be more of an option to go for a phased approach, so introduce it into one department, for example, make sure that works properly, learn from that, and then introduce it into the next department, rather than doing it all together in one big go. There will be an overall top-level project plan, of course, which you've continuously been updating throughout the 9 months of this project so far, and within that there will be a series of sub-plans, each covering specific activities that you'll need to have completed for the rollout phase. These actions or activities need to be clearly defined and allocated to specific individuals who have to complete them by a certain date. Typical planning sort of process, really. Sorry, my mouse got stuck there. I couldn't actually move it across the screen. Technology. I've called this thing scaling up. Whichever approach you adopt, the phased approach or the do it all in one go approach, you need to consider things like your infrastructure, your support services, the training programs, all the other background stuff that you need to support the rollout program. Consider whether they can actually cope as they are, or whether in fact they need to be increased or complemented in some way, and it's convenient to think of them in terms of staff, space and systems. So things like your policies and procedures, current and future plans for HR, technology, property, that sort of thing, as well as your training programs, and I'll touch on training a bit later on in the presentation. Your technical support and help desks will need to be scaled up as you scale up the rollout to support the end users, the actual people doing the WISE working. Also, you need to bring on board your suppliers to make sure you've got enough mobile phones, enough laptops, software provision already in place for the start of the rollout. Other departments within the organisation need to be kept in stream because they may have to up their game for short periods of time, again to support the rollout programme, and perhaps second staff to the rollout implementation team for a short period of time. Now, if you do that, those members of staff allocated out, of course, will have their day-to-day jobs, so provision needs to be made to help them, maybe cover them while they're working on the programme, so they don't come back on a Monday morning at the end of the project and find the mountain of work has built up. Think too about health and safety, which I'll touch on again as part of training. And bear in mind, it may be health and safety for wherever and whenever that work is done, and you as your employer have that responsibility. But again, I did say that most of our clients prefer the phased approach, which means it may be not so onerous on the resources you have. It's important to remember that you have stakeholders, which we identified earlier on in the programme, especially your senior management team, your directors and so on. They're your key stakeholders and need to be kept sweet and kept informed about what's going on, so you have their ongoing approval throughout the rollout phase. Hopefully they will themselves adopt WISE working practices, and then they can become your top level examples, champions. When I worked for Cable and Wireless, the telecoms company in the 1990s, over half of our main board of 30 people joined what we called the Global Office Programme, whereby you could work in America, Hong Kong, UK, wherever, and have the same support in place. They became key champions for the programme fairly early on in the rollout phase, and they actively promoted the programme, supported everyone doing it in their key areas of responsibility in the organisation, so they can be very important to you. You also have other stakeholders that need to be kept engaged and in the loop, suppliers, other departments, designers and so on, and their support can be quite critical. You can do this though simply through informal chats over a cup of coffee, as you see here in the picture, perhaps just using online media to keep in touch with them, but make sure that they know what's going on and where we are in the phase of the programme. Now, I touched on the training and education, which again is quite critical. It may be your existing training and education programs are sufficient for your needs and you just dovetail extra modules into it. And then that will be easier to manage. Think about training for IT. Do people who have laptops actually know how to use them? My wife is a midwife and was given a laptop, but there was no training or even indication about security you needed to provide for that laptop when she was travelling around doing home births. So the laptop may have sat on the back seat of a car. They weren't made aware that that could be a risk. Think about things like that. Health and safety might need just a few extra models pulled into it. HR, with all the procedures and things like expenses, might be put into an induction plan, for example. It will take a bit of time, a small amount of time, for your new WISE workers to become familiar and comfortable with the new work styles, and the training as a way of helping them along in that process can be quite important. And as well, hopefully a network of ambassadors that you've put in place will also help. And I'll touch on the work of the ambassadors now, because again they're a critical part of the rollout phase. Now, the ambassadors are typically people in your organisation who already work in the new ways of working. They've adopted it, they've tested it, maybe they've been in the pilot phase programs as well. They're there to support and guide your staff as they themselves move on to the WISE Work project. They have a variety of roles. Some clients are moving into new buildings from old released buildings, and the ambassadors there would act effectively as meeters and greeters, welcoming them to the new building, showing them around the building, showing them where things are, not just a coffee machine, but how they get technical support and so on. They tend to wear highly visible clothing during that period, but they're available again later on in the rollout phase. They can provide information and advice to new starters and generally serve as their guides, maybe for just a few weeks or as needed. They may later serve as mentors and coaches, perhaps for your management teams, so as they begin to understand how they've got to manage their teams in this new style of work. Effectively, they become your friend in need. But they can be quite important. Hopefully you'll have a few more senior level ambassadors there as well, working at their level in the organisation. Again, if the ambassadors have been recruited specifically from their own jobs, they may need someone else to help cover their existing day-to-day job while they do this role, especially if it takes a considerable amount of their time, which it could do in the early stages. Now, as we mentioned before, during all of the various stages so far in the 9 months, communications is vital. It never stops. For example, how will staff be made aware of the programme? How will they know that on a certain date they've got to move to a new building or have picked up a laptop and begun working at home, for example? How do they access information like that? Find out who they can turn to support for help and guidance. Case studies again can help. Keep publishing them in various formats using different media, including case studies of instances where WISE work hasn't quite worked properly or as planned, or in fact failed. This is a key part of your learning process. Other people can learn from it and or avoid making the same mistakes. So again, case studies, perhaps even a few external ones if they're relevant to what you're doing. Bring along your senior level champions to speak at events that help promote it, and it reassures staff that it's actually okay to do this because they at the top are actually doing it themselves. Remember too that communications can be both formal, perhaps as a formally managed part of the rollout plan, and informal. And informal communications can include simple things like delivering messages during team meetings, or people dropping in just for a few minutes to a team meeting and just running a small session, as well as one-to-one sessions. Now, these may be with your ambassadors or line managers, but the informal and formal needs to be catered for as well, and it can be quite an important part of your communication plan. Various forms of communication can be used, and the list here you see here is by no means comprehensive. There is a tendency now to move more towards electronic messaging and communications media because it probably has a greater reach, provided people can have access to it, of course. It's important to remember that all the messages you put out through the communications program that you deliver are both consistent and current. So it's no use using a daily blog based on old ideas, old information, because it will be out of date and can actually lead you to a few blind alleys. If you're using electronic forms of communication, these need to be maintained on a very regular basis, not just email, but if you have an internal blog system, for example, maybe you're using that every day, introducing new champions, new ambassadors, new ideas that can be exploited. We worked with one client in Hammersmith who came up with the idea of putting small flyers on tables in the staff restaurant at key times in the programme, and especially at the start of the launch. And these had things like the internal intranet web address to go to for information, people's names and extension numbers to turn to for help and support. And again, they were refreshed on a fairly regular basis as the programme developed. So there are various things you can do in terms of communication that are not too difficult, not too complicated, and in fact if you keep it simple, that's better. Now I mentioned internal communications there. This is an example from a client, Brighton and Hove City Council, of their dedicated internal website on the intranet. What you see here is the message from their chief exec to all staff who were moving on to their work styles program. It's interesting that for them, home working was not part of the equation. They were introducing things more like desk sharing in the office, team space, working on the move, that sort of thing. But these messages are quite critical, and again, they need to be refreshed fairly regularly, just to reassure people that everything's still going fine, and so on. There are links here through the menu screen to things like the terms and conditions of the program, who to turn to for support, and all those sorts of things, as well as access to the procedures for that particular program and the policies that are relevant. So again, quite important you get this right. Keep it simple. Short, sharp messages work best. As well as communications, of course, there are various guides and toolkits that can be used that are really helpful in the program. Perhaps you develop your own WiseWork manual, branded and available online, perhaps in paper as well. The range of toolkits that we use to work with clients, you can see here, is quite diverse. Developing team working in the new environment, coaching, those sorts of things. The training of your ambassadors, that may be a very specific new program you add to your toolkit. Perhaps just giving them extra coaching in how to become coaches themselves, how to become mentors themselves, how to communicate better. If people are adopting part-time and other forms of time-independent working, they may need specific guides and toolkits to help them do that. I've mentioned a home working starter pack, and that can include things like guides on information and data security in the new place of work at home. In terms of health and safety, perhaps there's a self-fulfillment checklist that people can use and maybe has to be completed by them before they can actually start working at home. Ideas on insurance in the home, and if just thoughts about maybe there's a special covenant on your property which prevents you working at home, those sorts of guides can be quite useful. Working on the Move guide should include hints and tips on personal safety, what to do if someone's threatened you and wants to steal your laptop from you. Do you defend it, life and death, or just let them take it away, but then immediately tell security so they can blank off network access and so on. Various things you can include in these guides. Now, as time goes on, even during the rollout phase, more people will join the WISE Working program. So they need their own form of induction. They need to go through the same levels of training that everyone else has done. Even if they're technically literate, they may still need a bit of guidance on the new forms of procedures to be used when they're working off-site, away from the offices and so on. Again, your ambassadors can help in this induction process, and so for them, their role may be an ongoing one throughout their time. as the program rolls out through the rest of the organization. Now, also, finally, perhaps, it's important to remember that as you roll this out and start adopting it, that you have to keep monitoring it and look at changes, what works, what doesn't work, in order to keep the Wise Work program current and up to date and relevant to the needs of the business and the needs of your employees, your staff, and perhaps to the needs of your customers, your clients. Key staff has to be tasked with this responsibility, perhaps delegated from your senior level team above, and perhaps deliver regular reports back up the chain to a senior level so they are reassured that everything is still working fine. There should be ways as well of allowing people to change their work styles, and that can be picked up in the monitoring process at various levels in the organisation. In a sense, this is the first step you will take during the rollout to Wise Work becoming business as usual. In effect, this is the way we now work here, and perhaps you include that in your new staff recruitment adverts and so on. I think at that point I'll stop because time is getting on a bit, and I'll hand back to Peter here for questions and answers.
Okay, thank you very much, Chris.
Just like pause.
Great to join you. And we get to the question and answer stage and indeed discussion. We've had quite a few questions in already, so I'll try and combine one or two of them because I'm not sure we'll get through all of them individually. There are a couple near the beginning, Chris, though, about where you mentioned the choice between a phased approach versus a whole across the organization. One question was about advantages and disadvantages of each, and then there was a separate one about what's the risks involved in doing it all at once. So perhaps you can combine those two.
Okay. Gosh, I guess the best example I can give is British Airways. During the early and mid-1990s, Coben Wise worked with British Airways as they closed down 15 buildings around the Heathrow complex and moved them into all what was then the new Waterside Park complex, which effectively was 7 new buildings under a sort of Astrodome covering the whole lot with a park and a landscape public park at the back, and even a little stream that ran through the middle of the public area. The way they approached this was you have no choice. Everyone will be adopting the new working practices, moving to the new building by certain dates, and that was a sort of phased approach department by department, but there was no choice. People knew that on a certain date their building they worked in would close, and they would have no desks unless they'd gone through quite a rigorous training and familiarisation and induction programme, which they called the British Airways Passport. Now, the passport itself was a small pocket-sized booklet. There was a greeting in the front from Walsh, the chief exec at the time, explaining what they were doing, why they were doing it, what it involved. And within the booklet were various tick boxes for the various training programs they had to complete and other things they had to complete before they moved. In a way, that reduced the risk because everyone at every level in the organisation knew what they had to do. The processes and procedures were in place to make that happen. They could book a training course, they could go on a familiarisation walkabout around the new site within certain time frames. So there was risk. Some people didn't want to move, and part of the risk was they actually left the organisation. And to some degree, HR had made allowances for that and was ready to recruit new people with the right skills at the right time. And that seemed to work quite well. So the level of planning there was very detailed, and again, that helps reduce the risk. But you can't foresee everything. On one of the days when the department was supposed to move into Waterside, a terrific thunderstorm cut out most of the power in the building they were actually moving into. And because their existing building was shut, we had to scrabble around and use alternate work centres for them for a couple of days until everything got back up and running. So again, building in contingencies can allow for most of those risks.
Okay, that's probably covered enough on risk, I think, Chris. We had another question saying, you mentioned about training managers. The question was, does that mean all managers? And if so, how much? A day, 2 days? You mentioned including it in existing programs, but if you're doing something separate, how much management training is really needed?
Okay, and some managers will be very comfortable with managing their teams, leading their teams in the new regime. Bear in mind, for some of them, they won't see some of their team members perhaps until the once a month weekly online meetings, face-to-face meetings, for example. Others may be working at hours different to their own manager's hours. So getting to grips with that and making sure that your team, your department is still on track can be a bit of or even perceived as a threat by some line managers. So usually what we do here is work with clients in the form of workshops, and we put them through the process of maybe managing their team, a day in the life kind of scenario. What sort of things can happen? What do you need to do to make sure your people can get in touch with you, you can get in touch with them? To some extent, this devolves down to a team level, and after a time, teams begin to develop their own procedures, their own protocols. We worked a while ago with Hertfordshire Council and some of their educational psychologists who were moving out of one building into another, but with fewer desks. And we evolved processes there with the management and the team working together in a workshop to say, okay, well, we will meet on certain days of the month. In the interim, this is what we will do to stay in touch. This is what we will do to report one-off incidents that may arise, and that works quite well. And again, it helps people buy into that, including the line managers, and getting their buy-in is quite important in that process. Some may be forced into this style, and those line managers after a time either adopt it quite happily, or in some cases they may leave. And that happened to me when I worked for France Telecom when we introduced a program, and some of the managers didn't like it and actually left after a period of time, although they did try to make it work. And again, if they're supported by the process, the system, the plan, that can help as well.
Obviously, they're about keeping managers in general involved. There's one specific question about somebody saying, I'm having trouble keeping my top stakeholders involved. Do you have any tips? Any other tips on involving the top stakeholders?
I think, well, one of the best ways is to actually help them adopt the work style themselves so they can actually see the benefits of it, even if it's just setting them up with the proper kit and equipment so when they get home they can still get online. You know, if it works for them, then it will help them better understand what's happening lower down in the organisation and help them buy into it. Constant communication. It's those sorts of things that help all the time. Perhaps even introduce them to their level of people in other organisations outside the business. And that can help, because if it's working somewhere else, then they should be able to see, well, actually, it should work for me as well.
Somebody here saying they like the idea of ambassadors. Do you reward them or pay them for being an ambassador?
I think there's two approaches to that. One, you just give them that extra task, but again, make sure that their day-to-day job is also covered maybe by other people or in other ways. They may, if they've done quite extensive training, become qualified trainers within your own terms of that, and maybe receive an allowance in the same way that first aiders might receive allowances, your resident firefighters, that fire stewards might receive extra allowances. Whatever you do, you have to document it and make sure it's written into your HR policies and procedures so people know it's there, and then it becomes more formalised. Doing it on an ad hoc basis to certain individuals only, I think, doesn't work.
So a specific question about Skype. They're saying you were talking about tools to help you, I guess, get the message out. How can tools like Skype be best used? I think the question probably was relating to using Skype as a method of rollout as opposed to just an ongoing tool in managing teams.
Yeah, and Skype and other video conferencing systems like it, those online meeting systems are very useful. Most people will have Skype now on their mobile phone, for example. You know, it's part of Microsoft's big organization, so it is available to all. It can become almost like a phone call to some people. You know, they may have a quick question about, well, how do I actually do this? And maybe Skype someone who might be off site but knows the answer. So it's that frequency. We use it within WiseWork to stay in touch once a month, although we do meet still regularly. And it may be that we're working on a small client project and we just Skype each other because we're trying to evolve a bit of a plan or something like that. So it can be quite useful.
Okay, I'm afraid time is up already. 30 minutes seems to have gone very, very quickly. So many thanks, Chris, for taking us through the whole rollout process and answering those questions. Thank you to everybody for attending. And you'll be pleased to know that the final one in this series is happening on Thursday, the 1st of December. This will be consolidating, having rolled out the program, really what do you then do to make sure it becomes normal practice, business as usual, and so on. And that would be in some ways a bit of a summary of everything we've covered during the year. So I hope to see many of you coming along on the 1st of December and sharing that final webinar with us. Thank you all for attending, and we look forward to that, plus the ebook that's going to come out at the end of the whole series. And thanks again, Chris, for taking us through this very interesting webinar. Bye for now.